I sat in the lawyer's office, watching in disbelief as my grandmother's attorney slid the inheritance documents across the polished oak table toward my sister Vanessa. 37 million. The entire family estate, 3 generations of careful investments, properties spanning 4 states, and the thriving art gallery business my grandmother had built from nothing. All of it now belonged to her. My parents sat on either side of Vanessa, their faces glowing with approval as she signed the acceptance, papers with an elegant flourish. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I don't understand, I managed to say, my voice sounding distant even to my own ears. Grandma always said the inheritance would be divided equally. My father's eyes finally met mine. No trace of apology in them, only that familiar look of disappointment I'd grown accustomed to over the years. Charlotte, he said with that patronizing tone he reserved specially for me, Vanessa has always prioritized family traditions and legacy. She deserves this inheritance more than you ever could. What none of them knew was that I had already discovered the truth about my grandmother's final days, about the suspicious changes to her will, and about the systematic manipulation that had been happening right under my nose. By tomorrow morning, they would understand exactly what I was capable of when pushed too far. Before we dive deeper into what happened next, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. If this story resonates with you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special just for you. The elegant conference room of Blackwell & Associates felt suffocating despite its generous proportions. The floor-to-ceiling windows showcased the Seattle skyline, rain sliding down the glass in sheets, matching my internal turmoil. I'd been summoned here for what my parents had described as an important family discussion about Grandma Eleanor's estate planning. At 92, my grandmother had passed away 3 weeks ago after a brief battle with pneumonia. The family matriarch, who had built Sinclair Galleries into a renowned name in the art world, was gone, leaving behind not just a financial empire, but a legacy of artistic appreciation that had shaped my entire life. I should have known something was wrong when my parents insisted on meeting at their lawyer's office rather than at the family home. "Is this some kind of joke?" I asked, struggling to keep my voice steady as I leafed through the summary documents. 10 years of dedicating my life to Sinclair Galleries, working my way up from assistant curator to creative director, and this was how they valued my contribution. Vanessa's perfectly glossed lips curved into a sympathetic smile, the kind she used for charity fundraiser photos and social media posts. "Charlie, be reasonable," she said, using the childhood nickname I'd long outgrown. Grandma was very specific about her wishes. "The gallery needs consistent leadership going forward, and you've always been so independent." Independent. The code word they'd used for years when what they really meant was disloyal, because I had chosen to earn an art history degree instead of the business degree my parents preferred. Because I had insisted on starting at the bottom of the gallery ladder rather than accepting a manufactured executive position. Because I had dared to introduce contemporary artists to our collection when the family had traditionally dealt only in classical works. Practical would be dividing things equally between Grandma's only 2 grandchildren, I said, addressing Mr. Blackwell directly. Or at least acknowledging the decade I've spent helping build Sinclair Galleries into what it is today. My mother's expression hardened. Patricia Sinclair Wells had built her reputation in Seattle's social circles on being uncompromising, a quality that had earned her both respect and resentment in equal measure. "The decision is made, Charlotte," she said firmly. "Vanessa has dedicated herself to preserving the Sinclair family traditions. She's earned this. I glanced at Mr. Blackwell, whose discomfort was evident in the way he shuffled papers unnecessarily. He had been our family lawyer for decades, had watched us grow up, had seen the dynamics between Vanessa and me evolve from childhood squabbles to something far more complex. "And what about Grandma's personal collection?" I asked. "The pieces she specifically promised would come to me?" The collection in question included several early works by female artists my grandmother had championed when nobody else would. Artists whose careers I had studied extensively and whose techniques had influenced my own modest paintings. A flicker of something, guilt, perhaps, crossed Mr. Blackwell's face before he regained his professional composure. "Those pieces have been designated as permanent installations at the main gallery," he explained, not quite meeting my eyes. "They're considered company assets now." The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. My grandmother had died just 3 weeks ago, after a brief illness that had progressed with startling speed. In her final days, heavily medicated and often confused, she had apparently signed documents I had never seen, documents that rewrote decades of stated intentions and careful planning. I turned my attention back to Vanessa, studying her closely. At 32, 2 years my senior, she looked every inch the gallery heiress in her tailored Burberry dress and pearls. The golden child. The dutiful daughter who had given up nothing and gained everything. "So that's it?" I asked. $37 million to Vanessa, and nothing for me? Not even Grandma's personal art collection or her journals? My father cleared his throat, adjusting his Rolex, a gift from my grandmother on his 50th birthday. "You'll receive her book collection and the cottage in Port Townsend." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story, the cottage. A charming but modest 2-bedroom on the Olympic Peninsula, worth perhaps a fraction of a % of the total estate. The insult was so blatant it was almost laughable. "How generous," I said, my voice dripping with sarcasm. Vanessa had the audacity to look offended. "Charlie, I know you're upset, but there's no need for that tone. This isn't personal. It's just business." Just business. The Sinclair family motto applied to everything from acquisitions to family betrayals. I wanted to scream, to flip the antique table, to demand justice. But years in the art world, navigating delicate egos and temperamental artists, had taught me that showing emotion was the fastest way to lose leverage. So instead, I smiled, the kind of smile that should have warned them all, had they been paying attention. "You know what? Keep it," I said, gathering my coat and bag. "All of it. I've never needed your money, and I certainly don't need it now." Relief washed over my father's face, the crisis averted, the difficult daughter once again managed. He had always underestimated me, mistaking my independence for weakness. It was a mistake he would soon regret. "That's very mature of you, Charlotte," he said, his tone softening slightly. "I'm glad you understand." "Oh, I understand perfectly," I replied, pausing at the door. "More than you can imagine." As I walked out of Blackwell & Associates and into the crisp autumn air, I pulled out my phone and dialed a number I had saved 3 months ago but never used. "Diana? It's Charlotte Sinclair. About those discrepancies you found. I'm ready to move forward." Diana Kwan, an investigative journalist with a reputation for exposing art world corruption, had approached me earlier that year with questions about certain irregularities she'd uncovered at Sinclair Galleries. suspicious provenance documentation, questionable authentication certificates, patterns that suggested systematic fraud spanning back nearly 2 decades. I had hesitated then, family loyalty briefly overriding my sense of justice. But now, as I walked away from that conference room with nothing but a worthless cottage and my grandmother's books, I felt no such constraint. My parents and sister thought they knew me. They thought I would accept this final insult as I had accepted all the others, with quiet dignity and eventual surrender. They had mistaken my patience for weakness, my strategic restraint for lack of courage. They were about to discover how wrong they had been. Back in my apartment overlooking Lake Union, purchased with my own savings and gallery bonuses, I spread Diana's documents across my dining room table. Authentication certificates with subtle inconsistencies. Provenance documentation with curious gaps. Internal emails between my father and Vanessa discussing creative solutions to provenance challenges. And there, buried among the gallery's administrative malfeasance, was something even more damning. Evidence that Vanessa had systematically manipulated my grandmother's medical care during her final illness, ensuring she was heavily sedated when signing the revised will. The inheritance wasn't just unfair, it was fraudulent. I poured myself a glass of the Cabernet my grandmother had taught me to appreciate, and stared out at the city lights reflecting on the dark water. By this time tomorrow, the Sinclair name would mean something very different in Seattle's art circles. The golden legacy would be tarnished beyond repair, and Vanessa, perfect, praised, prioritized Vanessa, would finally understand what it felt like to lose everything. I raised my glass in a silent toast to the coming storm. Sometimes justice required sacrifice. Sometimes revenge was simply accountability by another name. Tomorrow would change everything, and I was finally ready. The alarm on my phone chimed at 5:30 a.m., the same time it had for the past decade. I didn't need it anymore. My body was so accustomed to the schedule that I usually woke minutes before the sound. But routines had saved me more than once, and I wasn't about to abandon them now. My Queen Anne apartment was exactly what you'd expect from someone in my position. Elegant but not ostentatious. Impressive but not showy. Unlike my sister's mansion in Madison Park or my parents' waterfront estate, my home reflected who I actually was rather than who I wanted others to think I was. I went through my morning ritual with practiced efficiency, 40 minutes of yoga, a quick shower, a carefully assembled breakfast of avocado toast and cold brew coffee. By 7:15, I was dressed in a charcoal pantsuit, hair pulled back in a sleek ponytail, minimal makeup emphasizing my features without drawing attention to them. The uniform of a woman who wanted to be taken seriously in rooms full of people who would prefer she wasn't there. On my way out, I paused at the framed photo on my entryway table, my grandmother and me at the opening of our Tokyo exhibition. She was beaming with pride, her arm wrapped tightly around my shoulders. It was one of the few times I remembered her standing up to my father, insisting on me leading the international expansion despite his remarks about me lacking the necessary diplomatic finesse. 2 weeks later, she had backed down again, reverting to the peacekeeper role she'd perfected. Over decades of managing the strong personalities in our family, "I'm finally doing it, Grandma," I whispered to the photograph. "What you never could." The offices of Bennett Modern, Seattle's most innovative contemporary art gallery, were housed in a converted warehouse in the industrial district. As director of acquisitions, I had a corner office with views of the Puget Sound that rivaled those from the Sinclair Gallery's headquarters, though I'd earned mine through merit rather than inheritance. My assistant Marcel intercepted me as I stepped through, the glass doors already briefing me on the day ahead. The Tokyo shipment arrived safely. The New York Times critic confirmed for next week's opening. And Catherine Young called again about acquiring her newest installation, he reported, falling into step beside me. I accepted the coffee he handed, me taking a sip of the perfectly prepared Americano. Tell Catherine I'm very interested, but I need to see the completed work before making an offer. The materials list alone has raised some conservation concerns. Marcel nodded, making a note on his tablet. And your sister's office called. Apparently, there's an emergency board meeting at Sinclair this afternoon. They're requesting your presence. I nearly stopped mid-stride. An emergency board meeting? I technically still held a board position, a courtesy my grandmother had insisted on despite my father's objections. But I'd been excluded from any meaningful decisions for years. Did they say what it's about? I asked, keeping my voice neutral. Just that it's urgent and requires full board attendance. Ms. Vanessa specifically emphasized that your grandmother would have wanted you there. Using Grandma Eleanor to manipulate me. Typical Vanessa. But the timing was curious. The meeting couldn't be about the inheritance. That had been settled yesterday. Unless... Tell them I'll be there, I said, surprising Marcel, who knew how I felt about these sudden Sinclair summons. In fact, move my appointments to give me 2 hours of preparation time beforehand. In my office, I closed the door and opened my laptop. I had until 3 p.m. before I needed to present myself at Sinclair Galleries, plenty of time to finalize what I had been working on since leaving the lawyer's office yesterday. The file Diana had compiled was comprehensive, the product of 6 months of investigation. Gallery records showing pieces with suspiciously similar provenance documentation. Authentication certificates from experts who later denied ever having examined the works. Tax documents that dramatically undervalued certain acquisitions while overvaluing others for insurance purposes. But most damning of all was evidence that Sinclair Galleries had knowingly sold several pieces with falsified histories, creating elaborate paper trails to obscure the fact that the works had been acquired through questionable channels during the 1990s. Channels often linked to artifacts looted during periods of political upheaval. I wasn't naive about the consequences. Sinclair Galleries employed over 100 people, most of whom had no idea what was happening at the executive level. The gallery represented dozens of artists who relied on the Sinclair reputation to maintain their market value. When this broke, there would be collateral damage, careers disrupted, reputations tarnished, innocent people caught in the crossfire. For a moment, I hesitated. Was I really prepared to bring down the institution my grandmother had built? Was my hurt pride worth the fallout? Then I remembered her face in those final days, confused and sedated while Vanessa guided her hand to sign documents she couldn't possibly understand. I remembered the casual cruelty in my father's voice. She deserves this more than you ever could. My phone buzzed with a text from Diana. Meeting at 2. Bringing someone you should talk to. I replied with a simple confirmation, then stared out my window at the Olympic Mountains in the distance, their peaks shrouded in clouds. The emergency board meeting suddenly made sense. Someone had tipped them off. They knew something was coming. This wasn't a meeting, it was damage control. I needed to accelerate my timeline. At 1:45, I arrived at the small cafe Diana had chosen, strategically located halfway between Bennett Modern and Sinclair Galleries. She was already there, along with an elderly man I didn't recognize. "Charlotte, this is Henry Zhang," Diana said, as I sat down. "He was your grandmother's private art authenticator for nearly 30 years. My eyes widened in surprise. I knew the name well. Henry had retired 5 years ago, shortly after I had joined Sinclair full-time. His reputation for integrity was legendary in the industry. "Mr. Zhang, it's an honor to meet you," I said, extending my hand. "My grandmother spoke of you often." He took my hand in both of his grip surprisingly firm for a man in his 80s. "Ms. Eleanor was a remarkable woman," he said, his voice carrying a slight accent. "Which is why what happened to her legacy pains me greatly." Over the next 30 minutes, Henry filled in the missing pieces of the puzzle. He had been quietly maintaining records of every piece he had examined for my grandmother, including those he had refused to authenticate due to provenance issues. After his retirement, he discovered that many of those same pieces had mysteriously received authentication from other sources and been sold through Sinclair Galleries at significant profit. "I approached your father with my concerns," Henry explained, sliding a folder across the table. "He assured me it was a simple clerical error, that those pieces had never been sold." "But they had been," Diana interjected. "We've tracked at least 17 pieces that Henry rejected that later appeared in Sinclair catalogs with modified provenance documentation." "What did my grandmother say when you told her?" I asked, already suspecting the answer. "That is the tragedy, Ms. Charlotte." By the time I had gathered the evidence, Ms. Eleanor was already unwell. "Your sister intercepted my messages, told me your grandmother was too ill to be troubled with minor administrative matters." I opened the folder, finding meticulously kept records with photographs, dates, and detailed notes about each questionable piece. The most recent entry was dated just 2 months ago, well into my grandmother's decline, but before the pneumonia that ultimately claimed her life. "There's more," Diana said quietly. "Henry received this email just 3 days after your grandmother's death. She passed her tablet to me, displaying an email from Vanessa. "Mr. Zhang, now that my grandmother has passed and I am assuming control of Sinclair Galleries, I want to assure you that your continued discretion regarding historical authentication processes will be generously compensated. The monthly stipend will continue as arranged with my father, with a significant increase effective immediately." My hands were shaking as I set down the tablet. "They were bribing you?" Henry nodded, grimly. "For the past 5 years, though I never accepted a penny, I maintained the correspondence to gather evidence. Your grandmother deserved better than to have her life's work corrupted this way." I checked my watch, 2:30 p.m. The emergency board meeting was in 30 minutes. "They know something's coming," I said. "That's why they've called this meeting. They're going to try to get ahead of the story somehow." Diana nodded. "Which is why we need to move now. I have the article ready to publish, just waiting for your final approval." I stared at the documents before me, the weight of the decision pressing down. Once this was out, there would be no going back. Sinclair Galleries, my grandmother's legacy, would be forever tarnished. But the truth was, my father and sister had already corrupted that legacy beyond recognition. "Publish it," I said firmly. "And Henry, are you willing to go on record with your documentation?" The elderly authenticator straightened his shoulders. "For Ms. Eleanor?" Without hesitation. As Diana made the call to her editor, I gathered my things and prepared for the confrontation awaiting me at Sinclair Galleries. By the time I arrived, the article would be live. The carefully constructed facade my family had maintained would begin to crumble, and I would be there to watch it happen. Sinclair Galleries occupied a stunning historic building in Pioneer Square, its neoclassical facade a stark contrast to the contemporary art within. As I climbed the marble steps to the entrance, I felt a strange sense of calm. The anxiety that had accompanied me since yesterday's reading of the will had evaporated, replaced by a clear-eyed determination. I was buzzed through the security doors immediately. Apparently my arrival was expected. The click of my heels on the polished floor echoed through the main exhibition space, currently featuring a retrospective of American Impressionism that I had curated before being sidelined. Cecilia, my father's longtime assistant, intercepted me before I reached the boardroom. "Charlotte," she said, her voice low and urgent, "they've been in there for an hour already. Your father is not himself." I raised an eyebrow. "Not himself how?" "Agitated. He received a call about 20 minutes ago and has been shouting ever since." She glanced over her shoulder nervously. Something about a reporter asking for comment on authentication procedures. So Diana had already started making calls. Good. "Thank you, Cecilia," I said, genuinely appreciative of the warning. She had always been kind to me, even when office politics dictated otherwise. I pushed open the boardroom doors without knocking. The scene inside was exactly as I had imagined. My father stood at the head of the table, face flushed with anger, while Vanessa paced by the windows, phone pressed to her ear. The other board members, mostly longtime family friends and business associates, sat in uncomfortable silence, clearly caught in a storm they hadn't anticipated. All eyes turned to me as I entered. "Charlotte," my father acknowledged tersely. "You're late." I checked my watch pointedly. "Actually, I'm 5 minutes early." Vanessa ended her call and turned to face me, her perfect composure showing cracks around the edges. "We've been dealing with a situation that couldn't wait," she said. "Some ridiculous allegations from a disgruntled former employee." "Henry Zhang is hardly a disgruntled employee," I replied coolly, setting my bag on the table. "He was Grandma's most trusted authenticator for 30 years. The silence that followed was deafening. My father and sister exchanged a look of barely concealed panic. "You've spoken to him," my father said. It wasn't a question. "I have." I took a seat, positioning myself directly across from him. "Along with Diana Kwan from the Seattle Investigator. Fascinating conversation about authentication practices at Sinclair Galleries over the past decade." "Diana Kwan?" one of the board members asked. "Isn't she that journalist who exposed the forgery ring at Master's auction house last year?" My father's face had gone from flushed to ashen. "This is a family matter that's being blown completely out of proportion," he said, attempting to regain control of the narrative. "A few administrative oversights that 17 falsified provenance documents is not an administrative oversight," I interrupted. "Selling art with questionable origins to unsuspecting collectors isn't an oversight. It's fraud." "You have no idea what you're talking about," Vanessa snapped, but her voice lacked conviction. I pulled out my phone and set it on the table. "Henry kept meticulous records. Diana has copies of everything. The article should be going live right about now." As if on cue, phones around the table began to buzz with notifications. One by one, the board members pulled out their devices, faces growing increasingly alarmed as they read. "This is," one of them began, looking up at my father in disbelief. "William, tell me this isn't true." My father's composure finally cracked. Eleanor built this gallery from nothing, he shouted, slamming his fist on the table. Do you have any idea how hard it is to compete in this market? The compromises required? The shortcuts everyone takes? Not everyone, I said quietly. Grandma didn't. Your grandmother was a naive idealist who got lucky with her timing, he sneered. The market she built this gallery in doesn't exist anymore. I felt a strange sense of vindication. After years of pretending to uphold my grandmother's values while systematically undermining them, he was finally showing his true face. That's where you've always been wrong, I replied. Grandma's success wasn't luck, it was integrity. She built relationships with artists and collectors based on trust. That's what you and Vanessa never understood. Vanessa had gone very still, her face a mask of calculation. Always the pragmatist, she was already trying to figure out how to salvage the situation. We can fix this, she said, addressing the board rather than me. Issue a statement about an internal audit, promise full transparency moving forward. Blame a few junior authenticators who are no longer with the company. It's too late for that, one of the board members interrupted, holding up his phone. The article names you specifically, Vanessa, and William. It details a systematic fraud spanning years with quotes from multiple sources. Another board member, a lawyer I'd always respected, looked directly at me. Did you know about this before the will reading yesterday? I met his gaze steadily. I had suspicions. Diana approached me 3 months ago with questions. I began investigating discreetly, but I wasn't certain until I spoke with Henry today. Convenient timing, Vanessa said bitterly. The day after you were cut out of the inheritance. Speaking of the inheritance, I said, reaching into my bag and withdrawing a folder of my own. I had a very interesting conversation with Grandma's night nurse this morning. She was quite distressed about the medications Vanessa insisted on administering personally during Grandma's final weeks. The color drained from Vanessa's face. She kept a separate log, I continued, sliding the folder toward the center of the table. Documented every time she was instructed to step out of the room, every time she returned to find Grandma more sedated than the prescribed dosage would account for. Every document Grandma supposedly reviewed while heavily medicated. My father stood abruptly. This meeting is over. Charlotte is clearly attempting to deflect from her own failures by manufacturing. Sit down, William, the lawyer board member commanded with surprising authority. These are serious allegations with documented evidence. If even half of what's in this article is true, Sinclair Galleries is facing not just a public relations crisis, but potential criminal charges. As the reality of the situation sank in, the boardroom erupted into chaotic discussion. Some members were already calling their personal attorneys. Others were demanding immediate action, suspensions, independent investigations, damage control, strategies. Through it all, my father and sister stared at me with identical expressions of cold fury, the family resemblance never more apparent than in their shared rage. I gathered my belongings and stood to leave, my purpose here accomplished. The truth was out. What happened next would be up to the board, the authorities, and the court of public opinion. As I reached the door, Vanessa's voice cut through the chaos. You've destroyed everything, she said, her tone icier than I'd ever heard it. Decades of work, the family name, all of it. I hope you're satisfied. I turned back to face her one last time. No, Vanessa, you and Dad destroyed it. I'm just making sure Grandma's real legacy, her integrity, isn't buried along with her. As I walked out of Sinclair Galleries, the Seattle rain had stopped, leaving that peculiar golden light that sometimes breaks through late afternoon clouds. It felt symbolic somehow. Clarity after storm. My phone was already buzzing continuously with notifications. Messages from colleagues who had seen Diana's article, texts from friends checking if I was okay, and several missed calls from unknown. Numbers that were undoubtedly journalists seeking comment. I ignored them all and headed directly to the one place I knew I could think clearly, the small studio space I maintained in an artist collective near Lake Washington. It wasn't much, just a converted warehouse unit where I occasionally painted and stored the modest collection of art I'd acquired over the years. Pieces by emerging artists I believed in. Works that spoke to me rather than to investment potential. The collective was quiet when I arrived. Most of the artists either at day jobs or not yet settled into evening work sessions. I unlocked my space, flipped on the lights, and breathed in the comforting smell of linseed oil and turpentine. This room, with its northern exposure and unpretentious furnishings, was more home to me than my apartment had ever been. I sat on my paint-spattered stool and finally looked at my phone. 37 missed calls, 62 text messages, a dozen emails with subject lines like request for comment and Sinclair gallery statement. One message from Diana stood out. Article has 50K views already. Sinclair stock in free fall. Board called emergency session after you left. You okay? I wasn't sure how to answer that. Was I okay? The initial rush of adrenaline was fading, leaving space for more complex emotions to surface. I had achieved what I set out to do, exposed the truth, forced accountability. But there was no joy in watching my grandmother's legacy crumble, even if that legacy had already been corrupted from within. I texted back a simple, "I'm fine. Talk tomorrow." The next message was from Marcel at Bennett Modern. Catherine Young pulled her installation, says she doesn't want to work with anyone connected to the Sinclair scandal. Boss wants to see you first thing tomorrow. That stung more than I expected. I had built my reputation at Bennett Modern on integrity and careful curation. I'd never leveraged the Sinclair name to advance my position. But perception was everything in the art world, and right now, my family name was toxic. I set down my phone and walked to the corner of my studio where a cloth-covered canvas stood on an easel. I pulled back the cloth to reveal my grandmother's portrait, a piece I'd been working on since before her illness, capturing her as I'd always seen her, strong, vibrant, eyes alight with the passion for art that had defined her life. "Did I do the right thing, Grandma?" I whispered to the unfinished painting. "Would you have wanted this?" My mind drifted back to one of our last lucid conversations, just before the pneumonia took hold. She had been sitting in her favorite spot in the solarium, wrapped in a cashmere throw despite the warmth of the day, looking out at her carefully tended Japanese garden. "The art world is changing, Charlotte," she had said, her voice weaker than I'd ever heard it, but her mind still sharp. "Not always for the better. Money talks louder than ever, and too many people are willing to listen." "That's why your reputation matters so much," I'd replied. "People trust Sinclair because they trust you." She had looked at me then with an expression I couldn't quite read. "And what happens when I'm gone? Who will guard that trust?" I hadn't had an answer then. Or perhaps I hadn't wanted to acknowledge the question's implications, that she was preparing me for something, trying to warn me in her subtle way. A noise at the studio door pulled me from the memory. I turned, half expecting to see a fellow, artist or perhaps a journalist who had tracked me down. Instead, I found myself face to face with Henry Zhang. "Forgive the intrusion," he said, stepping into the space. "Diana told me I might find you here." "Mr. Zhang, please come in," I said, gesturing to the small seating area I kept for visitors. "Can I offer you tea? That would be most welcome." I busied myself with the electric kettle while he settled into a worn leather armchair, his eyes scanning the space with professional interest, lingering on my grandmother's portrait. "You capture her spirit," he said, nodding toward the painting. "Not just her appearance." "I'm not sure I've earned the compliment, but thank you," I replied, setting a mug of green tea before him. "It's still unfinished." "Like many things connected to your grandmother," he said cryptically. I sat across from him, cradling my own mug. "What do you mean?" Henry took a careful sip before answering. "Ms. Eleanor and I had many conversations. In the years we worked together, she was concerned about the direction William and Vanessa were taking the gallery, especially after you chose to leave." "I didn't leave," I corrected gently. "I was pushed out." "Semantics," he waved dismissively. The effect was the same. The voice of integrity was silenced, and other voices grew louder. We sat in companionable silence for a moment, the gravity of the day's events settling around us like dust after an explosion. "There is something you should know," Henry finally said, reaching into his jacket pocket. "Something I did not share with the journalist." He withdrew a small, worn leather notebook and placed it on the table between us. The cover was faded, but I could still make out my grandmother's initials embossed in gold. "She gave this to me 3 weeks before she died," he explained. "Asked me to keep it safe and ensure it reached you when the time was right." My hand trembled slightly as I reached for the notebook. "Why didn't you give this to me earlier today?" "Because then, you were focused on justice. Now I think you need guidance." The notebook was filled with my grandmother's distinctive handwriting, growing shakier in the later entries but still unmistakably hers. The first page was dated 2 years ago, shortly after I had left Sinclair Galleries for Bennett Modern. "I fear what is happening to my legacy," she had written. "William has always prioritized expansion over integrity, but now that Charlotte has left, there are fewer checks on his ambition. Vanessa enables his worst instincts, seeing only the short-term gains without understanding the foundation they're eroding." I flipped through pages of similar observations, my grandmother documenting her growing concerns about authentication processes, about financial decisions made without her full understanding, about conversations that stopped when she entered a room. The final entry, dated just days before her hospitalization, held a clarity that brought tears to my eyes. "I have made a terrible mistake in how I've structured my affairs. Trusting William to honor my wishes after I'm gone is folly. He has demonstrated repeatedly that profit outweighs principle in his mind. I must speak with Mr. Blackwell immediately to revise my will. Charlotte is the only one who truly understands what Sinclair Galleries was meant to represent. She must be given the authority to preserve what matters." "She never got the chance to change her will," I said quietly, closing the notebook. "No," Henry confirmed. "She fell ill the day after writing that entry. By the time I visited her in the hospital, she was already struggling to communicate clearly." I sat back, processing this new information. My grandmother had recognized the corruption taking root in her gallery. She had intended to correct course, to place the legacy in my hands rather than Vanessa's, and she had been prevented from doing so by illness, and perhaps by more deliberate interference. There's something else, Henry said, reaching once more into his jacket. This time he withdrew a USB drive. This contains high-resolution scans of all my authentication records, including detailed notes on the 17 pieces I rejected but the gallery later sold. There are also recorded conversations with 3 artists whose work was misrepresented. I accepted the drive, its small weight disproportionate to its significance. Why are you giving me this? Because the exposé is only the beginning, he said seriously. What follows will be denials, legal maneuvering, attempts to discredit the evidence. This provides additional verification that may become necessary. He was right, of course. My father and sister wouldn't surrender without a fight. They would hire expensive crisis management firms, top-tier lawyers, spin doctors to reshape the narrative. They would try to paint me as the disgruntled daughter, motivated by jealousy and revenge rather than justice. Thank you, I said carefully, pocketing both the notebook and the drive. For everything you've done, for being loyal to Grandma's vision. Henry smiled sadly. Ms. Eleanor gave a young immigrant authenticator his first opportunity when more established galleries wouldn't. Consider me. My loyalty was earned through hers. After Henry left, I returned to the portrait, adding careful brush strokes to capture the determined set of my grandmother's jaw, the subtle crease between her brows that appeared when she was evaluating a new piece. As I worked, my mind kept circling back to the final entry in her notebook. Charlotte is the only one who truly understands what Sinclair Galleries was meant to represent. What was Sinclair Galleries meant to represent? Not just a commercial enterprise, though my grandmother had certainly been proud of its financial success. Not just a family legacy, though the Sinclair name had become synonymous with fine art in the Pacific Northwest. No, what my grandmother had created was a space where artistic integrity and commercial viability could coexist without compromising each other, where emerging artists could find support and established ones could explore new directions, where the provenance of every piece was beyond question, the authentication process rigorous and transparent. Everything my father and sister had undermined. My phone buzzed again, this time with a message from someone I hadn't expected to hear from. Cecilia, my father's assistant. Your father and sister in closed-door meeting with lawyers. Board called for independent investigation. Security changing office access codes tonight. Thought you should know. I smiled grimly. The walls were already closing in. I worked on the portrait until well past midnight, losing myself in the therapeutic rhythm of painting. By the time I cleaned my brushes and packed up to leave, I had reached a decision about what came next. This wasn't just about exposing wrongdoing anymore. It was about reclaiming and restoring what had been corrupted. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, the kind of autumn day that showcased Seattle at its best. I dressed with particular care, choosing a cobalt blue suit that my grandmother had always said brought out my eyes. Today would be about first impressions, about presenting myself as someone with a clear vision rather than just a grievance. Bennett Modern was already buzzing with activity when I arrived. The news about Sinclair Galleries had dominated the art world overnight, with speculation running rampant about potential lawsuits from collectors, criminal investigations, and the gallery's future. David Bennett, the owner and my boss for the past 3 years, was waiting in my office. His expression was carefully neutral, but I could read concern in the tightness around his eyes. "Charlotte," he began as I closed the door behind me. "I assume you've seen the headlines?" "I have." "And Catherine Young's withdrawal from our winter showcase?" I nodded, setting my bag down and taking a seat. I've also seen the 3 other emails from artists expressing concerns about working with me, given my family connections. David's eyebrows rose slightly. You've been monitoring your work email. Of course. This isn't a personal crisis for me, David. It's a professional situation that requires professional management. He studied me for a moment, then shook his head with something like admiration. Most people would be hiding under a rock after unleashing the kind of storm you did yesterday. I'm not most people. No, he agreed. You're not. Which is why I hired you, and why this conversation is more complicated than it might otherwise be. Here it comes, I thought. The gentle push toward a leave of absence or a mutual parting of ways to protect the gallery's reputation. I need you to be completely candid with me, David continued. Did you know about the authentication issues at Sinclair before you came to work here? I had suspicions, I admitted. Nothing concrete enough to act on. But I would have never brought questionable practices here, if that's what you're asking. He nodded, seemingly satisfied. And the provenance of the pieces you've acquired for us? Beyond reproach. I've maintained relationships with several independent authenticators, including Henry Zhang. Every acquisition has multiple verification points, all documented in our files. David relaxed visibly. That's what I thought, but I needed to hear it directly. He leaned forward. Now, here's my proposal. Take 2 weeks. Let the immediate media frenzy die down. When you return, we'll announce a special exhibition, Authenticity in the Modern Market, or something similarly on the nose, highlighting our commitment to ethical acquisition and authentication practices. I blinked, surprised. You're not asking me to resign? Quite the opposite. I'm asking you to become the face of our response to this industry-wide problem. His eyes twinkled with the shrewd business sense that had made Bennett Modern a rising star in the art world. 1. Gallery's scandal is another's opportunity for differentiation. It was a brilliant strategy, acknowledging the issue head-on while positioning Bennett Modern as the ethical alternative to galleries like Sinclair. And it would allow me to continue my work without the Sinclair name overshadowing my own professional identity. But it didn't address the larger issue. What would happen to my grandmother's legacy? To the artists who had trusted Sinclair galleries with their work? To the staff who had no part in the fraud? I appreciate the vote of confidence, I said carefully, but I need to think about this. There are complications I need to address first. David nodded, standing to leave. Take the 2 weeks. Regardless. And Charlotte? Whatever you decide, you've done the right thing. Uncomfortable, painful, but right. After he left, I sat at my desk, staring at the small collection of art books my grandmother had given me over the years. Each was inscribed with a personal note. Each represented a moment when she had seen something in me. An appreciation for a particular movement. An understanding of a specific artist's technique, a curatorial instinct that matched her own. My phone rang. Diana. Have you seen it? She asked without preamble when I answered. Seen what? The board statement. It just went live. I quickly opened my laptop and found the Sinclair Gallery's website. The homepage had been replaced with a formal statement. The board of directors of Sinclair Galleries acknowledges the serious allegations regarding authentication practices and possible fraud. We have engaged an independent firm to conduct a thorough investigation. During this process, William Sinclair and Vanessa Sinclair Brooks have taken voluntary leaves of absence from their roles as CEO and creative director, respectively. The Board has appointed Morgan Williams as interim CEO while we determine next steps. We remain committed to transparency and to upholding the legacy of our founder, Eleanor Sinclair. Morgan Williams. The name wasn't familiar to me. Who is Morgan Williams? I asked Diana. That's what everyone's trying to figure out, she replied. As far as I can tell, he's some corporate restructuring specialist with no background in art. The kind of person boards bring in to clean house before a sale. A cold feeling settled in my stomach. They're preparing to sell the gallery. That would be my guess. Distance themselves from the scandal. Recover what value they can. The thought of Sinclair Galleries, my grandmother's life's work, being dismantled and sold off to the highest bidder was physically painful. It would mean the end of everything she had built, everything she had believed in. I need to make some calls, I told Diana. I'll get back to you. My first call was to Mr. Blackwell, the family attorney who had overseen the reading of the will. His secretary initially tried to block me, but I persisted until he finally came on the line. Charlotte, this is not a good time, he began, his voice strained. I have Grandma's notebook, I said without preamble. The one where she documented her concerns about Dad and Vanessa. The one where she explicitly stated her intention to change her will to give me control of the gallery. There was a prolonged silence on the other end. That's significant, he finally said, legal training evident in his measured response. But without an executed will reflecting those intentions. I'm not calling about a legal challenge to the will, I interrupted. I'm calling because I want to know if there's any provision in the existing will or the gallery's governance documents that would prevent the board from selling Sinclair Galleries to an outside entity. Another pause, longer this time. The will grants Vanessa controlling interest, he said slowly, but there is a provision in the original incorporation documents, insisted upon by your grandmother, that any sale or fundamental change in business structure requires a supermajority vote of both the board and the family shareholders. Family shareholders being you, Vanessa, and your parents. So I do have some leverage, I concluded. Theoretically, yes, but as a minority shareholder? Thank you, Mr. Blackwell. That's all I needed to know. My next call was to Henry Jiang. I need to gather the artists, I explained after outlining my emerging plan. The ones who've been with Sinclair since Grandma's early days. The ones whose reputations are beyond question. A coalition of the respected, Henry mused. Yes, I can help with that. But what are you proposing to them? A rescue mission, I said simply, and I'll need your help to make it credible. Over the next several hours, I made call after call, to artists who had long histories with Sinclair Galleries, to curators who had worked with my grandmother, to collectors who had trusted the Sinclair name for decades. By mid-afternoon, I had secured commitments from 12 influential figures in the Seattle art scene to attend an emergency meeting at my studio that evening. I also called Cecilia, my father's assistant, who was surprisingly forthcoming with information about the board's deliberations and the identity of Morgan Williams, indeed a corporate restructuring specialist with a history of preparing troubled companies for acquisition. They're meeting again tomorrow, she told me, to review preliminary offers. There are already 3 interested parties. So quickly? I asked, though I wasn't really surprised. Vultures circled dying businesses with remarkable speed. The board wants this resolved before the quarter ends, Cecilia explained. They're afraid of what a prolonged scandal might do to the Sinclair brand value. Thank you, Cecilia, I won't forget this. Your grandmother was always kind to me, she said simply. This isn't what she would have wanted. By 7 that evening, my modest studio was filled beyond capacity. Artists whose works commanded six-figure sums sat on paint-spattered stools next to curators from major museums and collectors whose private collections rivaled those of small galleries. All were connected by one thing, a genuine respect for Eleanor Sinclair and what she had built. I stood before them, beside my grandmother's unfinished portrait, and laid out what I had learned about the fraud, about the board's plans to sell, about my grandmother's documented intention to preserve her legacy through me rather than Vanessa. What are you proposing, Charlotte? Asked Maylene, a renowned ceramic artist who had given my grandmother her first show when Sinclair was still a fledgling gallery. A consortium, I replied. A group acquisition led by the artists and collectors who have the most to lose if Sinclair disappears or is absorbed into a larger corporate entity. That would require significant capital, noted James Harrington, a collector whose modern art collection was valued at over $100 million. Less than you might think, I countered. The scandal has dramatically devalued the gallery, and I believe I can block any sale without the consortium's participation through my shareholder rights. Even if we could raise the funds, said another artist, the legal complications would be managed by a legal team specializing in arts governance, I completed. I've already spoken with firms willing to take this on. The discussion continued for hours, concerns raised and addressed, possibilities explored and discarded. Throughout it all, I found myself channeling my grandmother's quiet authority, her ability to navigate competing interests toward a common goal. By the end of the evening, we had the beginnings of a plan, a consortium structure, initial funding, commitments, and a clear vision for what Sinclair Galleries could become. An artist-centered institution that maintained my grandmother's commitment to integrity while embracing new voices and perspectives. As the group dispersed, making plans to reconvene the following evening with additional stakeholders, Henry Zhang lingered behind. Your grandmother would be proud, he said, nodding toward the portrait. You found a way to preserve what matters, while allowing for necessary change. I looked at the unfinished painting, at the determined expression I had captured in my grandmother's eyes. It's what she taught me, that art isn't just about beauty or investment, it's about truth. And sometimes truth requires courage. Henry smiled, a spark of his younger self visible in his aged eyes. And sometimes courage changes everything. I awoke before dawn the following morning, my mind already racing with strategies and contingencies. Sleep had been fitful at best, fragments of dreams where my grandmother alternately praised and scolded me, where galleries transformed into labyrinthine courtrooms, where paintings changed their subjects when I wasn't looking. Rather than fighting the insomnia, I embraced the early hour. I made coffee, set up my laptop at the kitchen counter, and began drafting the formal proposal for the consortium. We would need something concrete to present to the board, something that demonstrated not just financial viability, but artistic vision. By 7, I had a solid framework. The Sinclair Legacy Trust, as I was calling it, would acquire controlling interest in the gallery, with governance shared between a council of artists and a small executive team. Initial funding would come from the 12 stakeholders I'd met. With last night, with additional investment opportunities extended to other artists and collectors who shared our vision. Most importantly, the gallery would establish a new authentication protocol, more rigorous, more transparent, more accountable than any other in the industry. We would not just recover from the scandal, we would transform it into an opportunity to set new standards. As I reviewed the draft, my phone rang. The screen displayed a number I hadn't seen in months, the direct line to my grandmother's personal residence. "Hello?" I answered cautiously. "Ms. Charlotte, it's Mrs. Abernathy." The voice brought an immediate smile to my face. Margaret Abernathy had been my grandmother's housekeeper for over 30 years, more a friend than an employee in the later years. "Mrs. Abernathy, it's wonderful to hear your voice. How are you?" "Concerned, dear, very concerned. I've been reading about what's happening with the gallery." Her Scottish accent, softened by decades in America but never quite gone, became more pronounced when she was upset. "Your grandmother would be heartbroken." "I know," I said quietly. "I'm trying to fix it. That's why I'm calling. There's something you should see, something she wanted you to have, but..." She hesitated. "Well, after she passed, Ms. Vanessa instructed me not to contact you. Said it would only cause you pain to go through her things." My grip tightened on the phone. "What is it, Mrs. Abernathy?" "I'm not sure exactly. A box she kept in her private study. She made me promise that if anything ever happened to the gallery, her words, not mine, I was to make sure you got it. Nobody else." "And you still have access to the house?" I asked, already reaching for my keys. "I still come in 3 times a week to dust and check on things. Ms. Vanessa hasn't changed the security codes. Probably hasn't thought about it with everything else going on." "I'll be there in 30 minutes, I promised." The drive to my grandmother's estate on Mercer Island felt both familiar and strange. How many Sunday brunches had I attended here? How many holidays and gallery planning sessions and quiet conversations? Over tea? Yet I hadn't been back since the funeral 3 weeks ago, when the house had been filled with art world figures and family friends, all sharing stories about Eleanor Sinclair while carefully avoiding any mention of the gallery's future. Mrs. Abernathy was waiting at the side entrance, her slight figure looking smaller than I remembered, her silver hair pulled back in its customary bun. She embraced me with surprising strength for a woman in her 70s. "You look tired, dear," she said, studying my face with the frankness of someone who had known me since childhood. "It's been an eventful couple of days," I admitted. She nodded knowingly. "Come, we don't have much time. Ms. Vanessa mentioned she might stop by this afternoon to collect some papers." We moved through the house quietly, though we were likely alone. The place felt different, already less vibrant somehow, as if my grandmother's energy had been sustaining it and was now slowly fading. Family photos still lined the hallway, art. Books still filled the library shelves, but there was a stillness that hadn't been there when she was alive. Mrs. Abernathy led me to the private study, a room that had always been my grandmother's exclusive domain. Even as children, Vanessa and I had known this space was special, requiring explicit invitation to enter. "She never changed the security code," Mrs. Abernathy explained, entering a 6-digit number on a small keypad beside the door. "Your birthday, dear, in the European format." I felt a rush of emotion at this small revelation. My grandmother had used my birthday to secure her most private space, not Vanessa's. The study was exactly as I remembered it. Walls lined with books and small art pieces, a massive oak desk positioned to capture the morning light, comfortable reading chairs arranged near the fireplace. This was where Eleanor Sinclair had done her real work, not the public-facing gallery direction, but the deep thinking about art's purpose and value that had guided every business decision. Mrs. Abernathy crossed to the fireplace and pressed a nearly invisible panel in the ornate wooden mantel. A small compartment slid open, revealing a lockbox. "The combination is the year the gallery opened, followed by your mother's birth month and day," she said, stepping back to give me privacy. I entered the numbers, my fingers trembling slightly. The lockbox opened with a soft click. Inside was a leather portfolio, the kind artists use to transport smaller works, and a sealed envelope with my name written in my grandmother's elegant script. "I'll leave you to it," Mrs. Abernathy said, heading for the door. "Take your time. I'll keep watch." Alone in my grandmother's sanctuary, I opened the envelope first. The letter inside was dated just 1 month before her death. "My dearest Charlotte, if you're reading this, then either I've finally gathered the courage to show you what I've discovered, or circumstances have forced Margaret to share this with you without my direct instruction. Given my cowardice thus far, I suspect it's the latter. The portfolio contains documentation I've been gathering for nearly 3 years. Evidence of practices at Sinclair Galleries that violate everything I've stood for. Practices I discovered too late, after they were already deeply entrenched. Practices I failed to stop. My greatest shame is not the fraud itself, though that is terrible enough. My greatest shame is that I suspected what was happening and did not act decisively to end it. I told myself I needed more evidence. I told myself I could guide William and Vanessa back to the path of integrity through example and gentle correction. I told myself many things to avoid confrontation, to preserve family harmony, to protect the Sinclair name from scandal. In doing so, I betrayed the very principles upon which I built my life's work. You were right to leave when you did. You saw what I refused to acknowledge, that the gallery was changing, that profits had become more important than provenance, that the Sinclair name was being leveraged for purposes I never intended. The enclosed documents provide a complete picture of what has been happening. Use them as you see fit. You are the only one I trust to make this right, in whatever way you determine is best. With love and faith in your judgment, Grandma Eleanor P.S. The small red notebook contains the original authentication notes for every piece in my personal collection, which I have always intended for you alone. Whatever happens to the gallery, this legacy is yours. Tears blurred my vision as I set down the letter and opened the portfolio. Inside, I found meticulously organized documents, emails printed and annotated in my grandmother's handwriting, financial records highlighted to show discrepancies, photographs of artworks with detailed notes about authentication concerns, and, beneath all this, a small red leather notebook containing handwritten provenance information for over 50 pieces. My grandmother's personal collection, pieces she had acquired throughout her career, not as investments but as personal connections, to artists she had admired and supported. I had always known these pieces existed, displayed throughout her home, occasionally loaned to museums, but never sold regardless of their increasing value. What I hadn't known was that she had intended them for me. Not for the gallery, not for Vanessa, but for me. The collection was worth millions, far more than the modest Port Townsend cottage that had been my only inheritance according to the revised will. But its true value wasn't financial. It was a tangible connection to my grandmother's aesthetic sensibility, to her relationships with artists spanning 7 decades, to her belief in art as something more profound than decoration or investment. As I carefully replaced everything, in the lockbox, a plan began forming in my mind, one that would require courage, strategy, and perfect timing. "Did you find what you needed, dear?" Mrs. Abernathy asked when I emerged from the study. "More than I expected," I replied, embracing her again. "Thank you for keeping your promise to her." "She wasn't always able to stand up to your father," the housekeeper said softly. "It was her one weakness. She could face down the most intimidating art dealer or the most difficult artist, but William could reduce her to uncertainty with just a look. Too much like her own father, she used to say." I nodded, understanding something fundamental about my grandmother that I had never fully appreciated. That her strength had coexisted with vulnerability, that her certainty in the gallery had sometimes faltered in family matters. It made what she had done, gathering evidence against her own son, preparing to challenge his leadership, all the more courageous. "I need one more favor," I said as we walked back toward the side entrance. "Can you tell me where the board is meeting today?" Mrs. Abernathy's eyes twinkled with something like mischief. 2:00 at the Olympic Hotel, the Rainier Room. She patted my arm. "Show them what Eleanor Sinclair's granddaughter is made of." I left with the lockbox securely in my possession, a renewed sense of purpose, and just enough time to gather the remaining pieces I would need for the confrontation ahead. My next stop was Bennett Modern, where I found David in his office reviewing applications for an upcoming emerging artists showcase. "I need to borrow Marcel for the afternoon," I said without preamble, "and I may need your help with something larger." David leaned back in his chair, studying me with interest. "You're up to something." "I'm saving my grandmother's legacy," I replied, "and possibly changing the Seattle art world in the process." His eyebrows rose. Bold claim. Bold situation. He smiled slowly, the expression of a man who appreciated audacity when he encountered it. "Take Marcel. Take whatever you need. Just promise me the full story afterward." Deal. Marcel proved invaluable over the next few hours, helping me coordinate with the consortium members, prepare presentation materials, and most importantly, arrange for a neutral third party, a respected arts attorney named Sophia Chen, to accompany me to the board meeting. "This is either brilliant or career suicide," Marcel observed as we finalized the proposal documents. "Possibly both." "Sometimes transformation requires risk," I replied, channeling what I imagined my grandmother might say in this situation. By 1:30, we were as prepared as we could be. The consortium members were on standby, the documentation was organized for maximum impact, and Sophia Chen was waiting for us in the lobby of the Olympic Hotel, an elegant Art Deco landmark in downtown Seattle that had hosted visiting dignitaries and artistic luminaries for nearly a century. "Are you sure about this approach?" Sophia asked as we rode the elevator to the meeting floor. "We could request a formal hearing, present our case through proper channels." "They've already had offers," I explained. "They're meeting today to review them. We don't have time for proper channels." She nodded, adjusting her glasses. "Just remember, let me handle the legal aspects. You focus on the vision." The Rainier Room was one of the hotel's premium meeting spaces, with views of Elliott Bay and the Olympic Mountains beyond. Through the partially open door, I could see the board members already assembled around a mahogany conference table, along with Morgan Williams, the restructuring specialist, and two people I didn't recognize but guessed were representatives from potential buyers. I took a deep breath, squared my shoulders, and walked in without knocking, Marcel and Sophia right behind me. The conversation stopped abruptly. 8 pairs of eyes turned toward us, expressions ranging from surprise to irritation. "Ms. Sinclair," said Howard Reynolds, the board chairman recovering first. "This is a private meeting. You aren't on the agenda." "I should be," I replied calmly, setting my materials on the end of the table. "Given that I'm here to present an acquisition proposal for Sinclair Galleries." A murmur ran through the room. Morgan Williams leaned forward, his corporate demeanor momentarily disrupted by genuine surprise. "You?" he asked skeptically. "You're making an offer for the gallery?" "Not just me," I clarified. "I represent the Sinclair Legacy Trust, a consortium of artists, curators, and collectors committed to preserving Eleanor Sinclair's vision for the gallery." Sophia stepped forward, distributing copies of our proposal to each person at the table. "My name is Sophia Chen, representing Ms. Sinclair and the Trust. You'll find our offer is financially competitive with what I assume you've received from corporate interests, with the added benefit of being structured to preserve the gallery's artistic integrity and cultural significance." Howard Reynolds glanced at the document, his expression hardening. "This is highly irregular. We have a process for reviewing offers." "A process that conspicuously excluded notifying me despite my status as a shareholder," I countered. "A minority shareholder," corrected one of the board members, a banker who had joined the board at my father's invitation. "A minority shareholder with blocking rights on any sale," I replied, watching his confident expression falter, "as outlined in the original incorporation documents." Morgan Williams was scanning our proposal with increasing interest. "This is unexpectedly comprehensive," he admitted reluctantly. "But the funding structure relies on commitments rather than secured capital." "Turn to Appendix B," Sophia suggested. "You'll find letters of credit from 3 financial institutions, verifying the availability of acquisition funds, contingent only on standard due diligence." The atmosphere in the room shifted subtly as the board members realized we weren't simply making a dramatic gesture. We had come prepared with a legitimate competing offer. "Perhaps we should hear Ms. Sinclair out," suggested Dr. Elaine Harper, an art historian who had been one of my grandmother's closest friends and had always been kind to me. "What exactly are you proposing, Charlotte?" I moved to the front of the room, my nervousness falling away as I began outlining our vision. Not just for saving Sinclair Galleries, but for transforming it into something more aligned with my grandmother's original mission. The trust proposes a complete restructuring of gallery governance, I explained. A dual leadership model with artistic direction separated from business operations, ensuring that commercial considerations never override curatorial integrity. I detailed our plans for a transparent authentication protocol, for a renewed focus on emerging artists alongside established names, for educational programs that would make art appreciation accessible to communities traditionally excluded from gallery spaces. But the most significant aspect of our proposal, I continued, is its recognition that Sinclair Galleries isn't just a business, it's a cultural institution with responsibilities beyond profit maximization. To emphasize this point, I opened my grandmother's red notebook. This is Eleanor Sinclair's personal authentication record for her private collection. 57 works by artists ranging from early Pacific Northwest masters to contemporary innovators she discovered and championed. I turned to face the board directly. Under our proposal, these works, which my grandmother left specifically to me as documented in this letter written before the suspicious changes to her will, would be donated to establish the Eleanor Sinclair Foundation, a separate but affiliated nonprofit that would use these works as the cornerstone of public education initiatives. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. The private collection was worth millions, potentially tens of millions, and I was offering to donate it rather than sell it or keep it for personal gain. "That's extraordinarily generous," Dr. Harper said finally. "But why? After everything that's happened, why not simply keep the collection and let the gallery face the consequences of actions you had no part in?" It was the question I had asked myself repeatedly over the past 24 hours. Why fight to save an institution that had betrayed not only me, but the principles it claimed to uphold? Why not walk away with my grandmother's precious gift and build something new, untainted by scandal? "Because legacy isn't just about inheritance," I said, finding the words as I spoke them. "It's about responsibility. My grandmother built something valuable. Not just financially valuable, but culturally significant. She made mistakes near the end, failed to stop practices she knew were wrong, but her vision itself wasn't flawed." I gestured to the proposal before them. "This isn't about erasing what happened or pretending the fraud didn't occur. It's about acknowledging it, making restitution where necessary, and creating systems to ensure it never happens again." I looked each board member in the eye as I concluded. It's about transforming a crisis into an opportunity to rebuild with greater integrity than before. For several moments, no one spoke. Then Morgan Williams closed the proposal document and looked up at me with what appeared to be genuine respect. "I've overseen dozens of corporate restructurings," he said. "Most focus exclusively on financial recovery, making the books look good enough for the next buyer. This is different." "Different but viable?" I asked. He nodded slowly. "Potentially. More viable long-term than a corporate acquisition, especially considering the reputational damage from the scandal." "We'll need time to review this properly," Howard Reynolds interjected, though his tone had lost some of its earlier dismissiveness. "This isn't a decision we can make today." "We understand," Sophia replied smoothly. "However, given the time-sensitive nature of Ms. Sinclair's offer and her legal standing to potentially block alternative sales, we would request an expedited review. Perhaps 48 hours?" After some negotiation, we agreed on a 3-day review period, during which the board would evaluate our proposal and meet with key members of the consortium. We also secured a commitment that no binding decisions would be made regarding other offers during this time. As we gathered our materials to leave, Dr. Harper approached me privately. "Your grandmother would be proud," she said quietly. "Not just of what you're trying to do, but how you're doing it, finding a path forward that honors her work without ignoring the problems." "I hope so," I replied. "Sometimes I'm not sure if I'm fighting for her legacy or trying to redefine it." Dr. Harper smiled. "Perhaps they're the same thing. No legacy worth preserving remains static, Charlotte. It evolves, adapts, learns from mistakes." She squeezed my arm gently. "That's why she always believed in you more than anyone. You understand that art isn't precious because it's perfect. It's precious because it's true." As we left the Olympic Hotel, Marcel let out a long breath. "That was intense. But I think you got through to them." "We'll see," I said, not wanting to assume victory prematurely. "We still have significant obstacles to overcome." "Like your father and sister?" I nodded grimly. "They won't surrender control without a fight, board decision or not. Marcel checked his phone. Speaking of which, you've got 6 missed calls from Vanessa in the last hour. Let me guess, she's heard about our meeting with the board. Almost certainly. News travels fast in small circles. I considered my options. Avoiding Vanessa would only delay the inevitable confrontation, potentially allowing her to develop countermeasures. Better to face her directly, on my terms rather than hers. Call her back, I decided. Tell her I'll meet her at Grandma's house in an hour. The confrontation that was coming wouldn't be easy, but it was necessary, not just for the gallery's future, but for my own peace of mind. Too much had been left unsaid between Vanessa and me for too long. If we were going to move forward, either as adversaries or unlikely allies, certain truths needed to be acknowledged. As Marcel made the call, I found myself thinking about something my grandmother had often said when teaching me about art authentication. The truth of a piece isn't just in its documented history, Charlotte. It's in the work itself. In what was created, how it was created, and why. Learn to see that truth, and no forgery will ever deceive you. It was time to face the truth of the Sinclair family, not just the documented fraud, but the deeper patterns that had allowed it to flourish. Only then could we begin to create something authentic from the fragments that remained. The drive back to my grandmother's estate felt different this time, purposeful rather than nostalgic. I was no longer visiting a place of memories, but entering a battleground of sorts. Marcel had offered to accompany me, but this confrontation needed to be private. Some family reckonings were too raw for witnesses. As I pulled into the circular driveway, I noticed Vanessa's Audi already parked near the entrance, its glossy, black finish gleaming in the afternoon sun. My sister had always preferred things that signaled status: cars, clothing, addresses. It wasn't simple materialism. It was the security of external validation. Mrs. Abernathy met me at the door, her expression concerned. "She's in the solarium," she said quietly. "Been pacing for 20 minutes. "Thank you," I replied, squeezing her hand gently. "It'll be okay." "Remember who you are," she advised, an echo of something my grandmother used to say when I faced challenges. "Not just a Sinclair, Charlotte." I made my way through the house, past the art-lined hallways and antique furnishings, toward the glass-enclosed room at the rear that had been my grandmother's favorite retreat. The solarium faced west, capturing afternoon light and offering views of the Japanese garden she had meticulously designed over decades. Vanessa was standing with her back to the door, staring out at the garden, a glass of what appeared to be scotch in her hand. At 2:30 in the afternoon, this was unusual enough to signal her distress. "You didn't waste any time," she said without turning, having heard my footsteps on the marble floor. "Barely 3 days since the will reading, and you're already trying to take everything." "That's an interesting interpretation," I replied, keeping my voice neutral as I moved into the room. "I'd say I'm trying to save what matters." She turned then, and I was struck by how exhausted she looked. The polished facade had slipped, her makeup less precise than usual, her eyes shadowed by sleepless nights. The scandal was taking its toll. By undermining me to the board? By going behind my back with some consortium scheme? She took a sip of her drink. "You always were calculating, even as a child." Calculating? I couldn't help but laugh at the irony. That's rich coming from someone who manipulated our grandmother's medical care to ensure she signed documents she couldn't possibly understand. Vanessa flinched visibly, though she recovered quickly. "You have no idea what you're talking about." I have sworn statements from her night nurse. I have medication logs showing dosage inconsistencies. I have security footage showing you entering her room with legal documents on 3 separate occasions when she was heavily sedated. I kept my tone matter-of-fact, not accusatory. Would you like me to continue? She set her glass down hard enough that some of the amber liquid sloshed over the rim. What do you want, Charlotte? Money? A position at the gallery? Name your price and let's end this circus. It's not about money, I said, moving to stand directly across from her. It never was. Everything is about money eventually. That's where you and I have always differed. That's why Grandma trusted me with her personal collection, because she knew I understood that the art was never just an asset class to her. Something flickered across Vanessa's face. Surprise, perhaps, or momentary doubt. What are you talking about? What personal collection? I retrieved the red notebook from my bag and placed it on the small table between us. 57 pieces that were never part of the gallery inventory. Artists she believed in. Works she acquired because they moved her, not because they would appreciate. Vanessa picked up the notebook, flipping through it with growing disbelief. This can't be right. The major pieces in this house are gallery assets. They're listed in our insurance documents. Check again, I suggested. Those documents list Sinclair Family Trust as the owner, not Sinclair Galleries. A distinction that apparently everyone, including our father, overlooked. She sank into one of the wicker chairs, the notebook still open in her hands. And she left these to you? All of them? Yes. Why? The simplicity of the question caught me off guard. I had expected denial, accusations, legal threats, not this sudden vulnerability. Because we shared the same values about art, I said finally. Not just its monetary worth, but its cultural significance, its emotional impact, its ability to change how we see the world. Vanessa closed the notebook carefully. She never saw that in me, no matter how hard I tried. The admission surprised me, a glimpse behind the competitive facade we had both maintained for so long. You didn't try to see art her way, I pointed out gently. You tried to make her see it your way, as an investment strategy, as a status symbol, as a business, because that's what kept the gallery viable. Her voice rose momentarily before she controlled it. Do you have any idea how competitive the market has become? How many historic galleries have closed because they couldn't adapt to changing collector preferences? Adaptation doesn't require fraud, Vanessa. She looked away, unable to meet my eyes. It started small, just one piece with a questionable provenance gap, but an important client really wanted it. Her voice had grown quiet. Dad said it was a one-time exception. Then it became 2 exceptions, then a pattern, then a strategy. I sat in the chair opposite her, trying to reconcile this moment of honesty with the sister who had always seemed so certain, so unapologetic in her ambition. Why are you telling me this? Vanessa met my gaze directly for the first time. Because it's over, isn't it? The career I've built, the reputation I've cultivated. Once the full investigation concludes, I'll be lucky to avoid criminal charges, let alone work in the art world again. There was no self-pity in her tone, just a clear-eyed assessment of her situation. It was perhaps the most genuine I'd seen her in years. It doesn't have to end that way, I said carefully. Not entirely. Her eyebrows rose skeptically. What do you mean? The consortium's proposal includes a path to transparency and restitution, full disclosure of authentication issues, return of questioned works to their rightful owners where applicable, compensation for collectors who purchased pieces with falsified provenance. That would be financially ruinous. For the gallery, as currently structured, yes, but not for the reimagined institution we're proposing. I leaned forward. The donated personal collection would establish sufficient cultural capital to rebuild trust. The organizational restructuring would separate past leadership from future direction. Vanessa studied me with new interest. And where exactly do I fit in this grand vision? It was the question I had been wrestling with since forming the consortium. The easy answer, the vengeful answer, would be nowhere. Let her face the consequences of her actions without mitigation. But that approach contradicted the very principles I was fighting to restore. That depends on you, I said honestly. On your willingness to acknowledge what happened, to participate in making it right, to redefine your relationship with the gallery and with art itself. She laughed, though there was no humor in it. You want me to publicly confess? To fall on my sword for the greater good of Sinclair Galleries? I want you to have the opportunity to be part of the solution rather than just the problem. And Dad? Where does he fit? I hesitated. My father's role in the fraud was more extensive, his motivations less complex. Simple greed without even Vanessa's misguided belief that she was ensuring the gallery's survival. That's his choice to make, but his path to redemption would be considerably steeper than yours. Vanessa was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the Japanese garden where the late afternoon sun was creating long shadows across the carefully arranged stones and precisely trimmed shrubs. She designed every element of that garden herself. You know, she said finally, studied traditional Japanese aesthetics for years before placing a single stone. I always thought it was excessive. The attention to authenticity, the rejection of shortcuts, the patience. And now? Now I wonder if she was trying to teach us something all along. She turned back to me. What exactly would acknowledgement look like in your proposal? The question was practical, specific, a shift from abstract morality to concrete terms. It was the businesswoman in her, evaluating options. A public statement taking responsibility for your role in the authentication issues. Cooperation with the independent investigators to identify all affected works. Acceptance of a redefined position within the gallery structure, one focused on donor relations rather than authentication or acquisition. A demotion, she noted. A recalibration, I corrected. Using your actual strengths rather than forcing you into roles that compromised your integrity. She raised an eyebrow. I have strengths? You're exceptional with collectors. You remember their children's names, their spouses' interests, their collection priorities. You build relationships that last because people genuinely enjoy interacting with you. That's valuable, Vanessa. It's just not the only value that matters in an art gallery. She seemed momentarily taken aback by the assessment. Perhaps the first time I had acknowledged her talents without qualification or competition. And what would you do in this new structure? Co-direct with a focus on artistic vision and authentication integrity. Essentially the role Grandma originally envisioned for me before Dad intervened. Vanessa nodded slowly, processing the proposition. The board would need to approve all this. They're not exactly feeling generous toward the Sinclair family at the moment. They're reviewing our proposal now. Your participation, your honest participation, would strengthen the case for restoration, rather than dissolution. And if I refuse? If I fight this? Then the full evidence goes to the authorities, the media gets every detail, and the gallery likely collapses under the weight of litigation and scandal. I kept my voice gentle but firm. Nobody wins in that scenario, Vanessa. Not you, not me, not the artists who trusted Sinclair with their careers, not the staff who had nothing to do with the fraud. She stood and walked to the window, her back to me again. For nearly a minute she said nothing, just stared out at the garden as shadows lengthened across the stones. "I need to think," she said finally. "And I need to speak with Dad. The board wants our answer in 3 days. You'll have it tomorrow." She turned, her expression more resolved than I had expected. "One way or another, this ends soon." As I prepared to leave, she called my name, stopping me at the doorway. "Charlotte, the personal collection. What are you planning to do with it? Really?" "Exactly what I told the board," I replied. "Donate it to establish the foundation. It's what Grandma would have wanted." She studied me for a moment, then nodded slightly. "Yes," she said quietly. "It is. It wasn't reconciliation, not yet. But it was acknowledgement, perhaps the first step toward something neither of us had thought possible. A relationship based on truth rather than competition." The next 24 hours passed in a blur of activity. The consortium members met to refine our proposal. Henry Jang worked with me to prepare detailed authentication records for the personal collection. Marcel coordinated with Sophia Chen to address legal questions from the board. Through it all, I kept expecting to hear from Vanessa. A call, a text, something indicating which path she had chosen. But there was only silence from both her and my father. "No news from the enemy camp?" Diana asked when she called for an IR update. "They're not the enemy," I corrected her, surprising myself with the conviction in my voice. "They're people who made terrible choices. There's a difference." "Quite the philosophical distinction when they were perfectly happy to leave you with nothing 3 days ago," she noted dryly. "I'm not defending them. I'm just trying to see the situation with more nuance." "The mark of a good leader," Diana observed. "Speaking of which, my sources tell me the board is leaning toward accepting your proposal, contingent on a few modifications." This was encouraging news, though I tried not to get ahead of myself. "What kind of modifications?" "More independent. Oversight initially. A probationary period for the new governance structure. Standard caution after being burned so badly." "Reasonable requests," I agreed. "Anything else?" "Just one thing. They want a unified family statement. You, Vanessa, and your father presenting a cohesive vision for the gallery's future." My heart sank. "That's potentially problematic." "I thought so." Diana's voice softened slightly. "For what it's worth, I think you've constructed a remarkable solution to an incredibly complex problem. Whatever happens now, you've honored your grandmother's legacy in ways that matter." After we hung up, I found myself drawn back to my studio, to the unfinished portrait of my grandmother. I had been avoiding it since the scandal broke, uncertain how to capture the complexity of her legacy now that I understood both her strengths and her failings more fully. As I stood before the canvas, studying the half-completed image, my phone rang. "Vanessa." "I'm at Dad's apartment," she said without preamble. "We need to talk, all of us. Can you come?" My father's downtown penthouse was the last place I wanted to be, but the decisive moment had arrived. "I'll be there in 30 minutes," The luxury high-rise where my father lived offered sweeping views of the city and Elliott Bay beyond. The kind of vista that suggested mastery over all it surveyed, very much aligned with William Sinclair's self-image. As the private elevator opened directly into his apartment, I steeled myself for whatever confrontation awaited. But the scene that greeted me was not what I had expected. My father sat in his leather armchair looking diminished somehow, his usual commanding presence reduced by circumstances he couldn't control. Vanessa stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, her posture tense but composed, and between them, spread across the glass coffee table, were dozens of documents, emails, financial records, authentication certificates. "Charlotte," my father acknowledged, his voice lacking its usual authority. "Thank you for coming." The formality was strange coming from him. Throughout my childhood and adult life, he had never thanked me for anything. Compliance was expected, not appreciated. "Vanessa said you wanted to talk," I replied, remaining standing just inside the entryway. "I'm listening." Vanessa turned from the window. "I've shown Dad everything. The nurse's statements, the security footage, Henry Jung's documentation, Grandma's notebook." She gestured to the papers on the table. "And I've added my own records. Everything I knew about, participated in or suspected." I glanced at my father, trying to gauge his reaction to this apparent betrayal. His expression was unreadable. "The board contacted us this afternoon," he said after a moment. "They're prepared to accept your consortium's proposal with conditions." "I've heard, including a unified family statement." He picked up a tumbler of what looked like straight scotch, swirling the amber liquid but not drinking. "They want us to present together, the three remaining Sinclairs acknowledging past failures and endorsing the new direction." "Can you do that?" I asked directly. "Can you publicly admit what you've done?" He set the glass down untouched. "I've spent 30 years building Sinclair Galleries into an international name. I've made compromises, some more defensible than others." He looked up at me, his gaze steady. "But I've never had to face my mother and explain those compromises." It took me a moment to understand what he was saying. "This is about Grandma? About disappointing her?" "My mother built that gallery on a foundation of absolute integrity," he said quietly. "Every piece authenticated beyond question. Every provenance documented with multiple sources. Every relationship with artists based on mutual respect. Principles you abandoned," I noted, keeping my tone neutral. "Principles I convinced myself were outdated, unnecessary in a modern market." He gestured to the documents surrounding him. I was wrong, catastrophically wrong. Coming from a man who had never admitted error in my lifetime, this was extraordinary. I glanced at Vanessa, who gave a small nod as if to confirm this wasn't some elaborate performance. "We're prepared to issue the unified statement," she said. "On your terms. Full disclosure, full acceptance of responsibility, full support for the consortium's vision." I moved further into the room, studying both of them carefully. Why the change of heart? Why not fight this legally, drag it out, protect whatever assets you can? My father looked at Vanessa, then back to me. "Because your sister helped me understand what's actually at stake. Not just money or reputation, but the one thing your grandmother valued above everything." "Integrity," I supplied. "Legacy," he corrected. "Not the Sinclair name, but what that name represents in the art world, the principles it stands for, the trust it signifies." It was surreal hearing these words from a man who had systematically undermined those very principles for years. Yet there seemed to be genuine regret in his voice, in his demeanor. "The consortium proposal is better than we deserve," Vanessa added. "It preserves what matters about Sinclair Galleries while holding us accountable for our actions." "It's not about what anyone deserves," I found myself saying, echoing what I had told the board. "It's about what serves the greater purpose, honoring authentic art and the people who create it." For the first time in our complex relationship, I saw respect in my father's eyes, not the grudging acknowledgement of my professional achievements, but genuine recognition of my vision and principles. "We'll need to coordinate the statement," I said, decision made. "The board wants to make an announcement by tomorrow evening." Vanessa nodded. "We've drafted something. Obviously, you'll want to review and revise." As we worked through the statement over the next few hours, something unexpected happened. We actually collaborated effectively. My father's precision with language, Vanessa's understanding of key stakeholders, my commitment to transparency, each contribution strengthened the final product. The statement acknowledged the authentication fraud without equivocation, detailed the steps being taken to identify and address all affected works, and expressed unqualified support for the consortium's governance model. My father and Vanessa would resign from operational roles but remain available to assist with the transition and remediation efforts. Most importantly, it articulated a renewed commitment to the founding principles Eleanor Sinclair had established: artistic integrity, authentication rigor, and cultural responsibility above commercial interests. By the time we finished, night had fallen over Seattle, the city lights creating a constellation of human activity below us. The three of us stood together at the windows, looking out at the urban landscape, a rare moment of alignment after years of division. "I've been thinking about the personal collection," my father said, breaking the comfortable silence. "About why Mother left it specifically to you." I waited, curious where this was going. "It wasn't just that you shared her values about art," he continued. "It was that she trusted you to see beyond the individual pieces to what they represented collectively." "Oh, philosophy about art's purpose." "Which was?" Vanessa asked. "That great art isn't valuable because it's rare or expensive or created by famous names," I replied, understanding dawning as I spoke. "It's valuable because it shows us truth about ourselves and our world in ways nothing else can. It creates connections across time and culture. It reminds us of our humanity." My father nodded slowly, a perspective I lost sight of somewhere along the way. "We all lose sight of important truths sometimes," I said, surprising myself with the generosity of the sentiment. "What matters is finding our way back." The following evening, we stood together in the main gallery of Sinclair's downtown location, my father, Vanessa, and I, facing the assembled board members, key consortium representatives, selected press, and gallery staff. The space had been arranged for the announcement, with my grandmother's portrait, borrowed from the estate, positioned prominently beside the podium. Vanessa spoke next, her usual polish tempered by genuine remorse. "I participated in and perpetuated practices that violated everything this gallery was built to represent. I failed our artists, our collectors, our staff, and most significantly, the legacy of Eleanor Sinclair. I am committed to making this right, however long that process takes." Then it was my turn. As I moved to the podium, I felt the weight of the moment. Not just the public statement, but the transition it represented. For decades, the Sinclair name in the art world had been defined by my grandmother's vision, then corrupted by my father's compromise. Now it would be something new, something that acknowledged both the brilliance of its founding and the failure of its stewardship, something committed to restoration and evolution rather than mere preservation. Eleanor Sinclair believed that great galleries don't just sell art, they serve it, I began. They serve artists by representing their work with honesty and respect. They serve collectors by ensuring the authenticity and provenance of every piece. They serve the public by making art accessible and meaningful across cultural and economic boundaries. I gestured to the consortium members seated in the front row. The Sinclair Legacy Trust is committed to restoring these principles while acknowledging that restoration isn't the same as returning to the past. We must evolve, innovate, and expand our understanding of art's role in society. I outlined the concrete steps we would take: the independent authentication review of the entire collection, the establishment of the Eleanor Sinclair Foundation, with the donated personal collection, the new governance structure that separated artistic direction from business operations. But perhaps most importantly, I concluded, we commit to transparency. Not just about our successes, but about our failures. Not just about our future plans, but about our past mistakes. Because integrity in the art world isn't measured by perfection. It's measured by honesty about imperfection. As the formal presentation ended and the attendees moved into the reception area for the obligatory networking, Henry Zhang approached me, his eyes bright with approval. "You have honored her," he said simply. "Not by hiding the difficult truths, but by facing them and finding a path forward." "We still have so much work to do," I admitted. "Rebuilding trust takes more than one good speech." "Yes," he agreed, "but you have laid the foundation correctly. Everything else can now be built upon it." Later that evening, after the last guests had departed and the press had filed their stories, I returned to my studio. The unfinished portrait of my grandmother still stood on the easel, waiting for the final touches that would bring it to completion. As I picked up my brushes, I realized what had been missing. Not in the technical execution, but in my understanding of my subject. I had been trying to paint the grandmother I had idolized, infallible, perfect in her artistic judgment and business acumen. But the true Eleanor Sinclair had been more complex, visionary yet sometimes compromising, principled yet occasionally reluctant to confront those she loved, brilliant yet human in her blind spots and vulnerabilities. I worked through the night, adjusting subtle elements of the portrait to reflect this more nuanced understanding. A hint of uncertainty in the eyes balanced by determination in the jaw. Wisdom in the smile tempered by the awareness that wisdom often comes through error. By dawn, it was finished. Not idealized, but authentic. Not perfect, but true. In the soft morning light, I stepped back to evaluate the completed work. It captured something essential about my grandmother, not just her appearance, but her spirit. The complexity of a woman who had built something remarkable, seen it falter, but created a legacy resilient enough to survive that faltering. My phone chimed with a message from Marcel. "Board signed off on everything. We're official. Press release goes out at 9 a.m. History in the making." I smiled, setting my brushes aside. The inheritance I had been denied turned out to be far more valuable than the money or properties I might have received. I had inherited a vision, a responsibility, and ultimately, the opportunity to transform a personal loss into a collective restoration. Sometimes justice arrives in unexpected forms. Sometimes what we lose opens the door to something more meaningful than what we thought we wanted. And sometimes the greatest legacy isn't what's left to us, but what we choose to build from what remains. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.